Hi, I'm David Barr Kirtley, host of Geek's Guide to the Galaxy and author of the book Save Me Please and Other Stories, which is available now on Amazon.com. We had a great conversation about the book back in episode 500, so definitely check that out if you missed it. And I want to give a special thank you to Pablo Ruz, who just gave the book a 5-star review on Amazon.com. It says, "I've been following David's podcast for a few years now, and it came as a surprise when he announced the long overdue release of a book collecting his best short stories. I had heard Power Armor a Love Story and was curious, so I bought it, not really being an avid reader of short stories, and it was a great surprise. The structure of the book in 3 parts is a good choice, 1 fantasy, 2 sci-fi, and 3 horror, as it gives you some idea of what kind of stories you'll encounter in each section. And they're all really good, at times truly excellent. For me, the highlights are They Go Bump, Red Road, and the superlative Veil of Ignorance. The ideas in the science fiction stories are all thought-provoking. The fantasy worlds are well realized in just a few pages. But most important of all, the stories are a lot of fun, even though sometimes the dark humor caught me off guard. I hope we can get some more books from Geek's Guide Press in the future." So big thanks again to Pablo Ruz for that great review. Alright, so now let's get to our show.
Wired.com presents The Geek's Guide to the Galaxy. And here is your host, David Barr Kirtley.
Hello, and welcome to episode 543 of Geek's Guide to the Galaxy. Today on the show, we'll be discussing the classic 70s science fiction movies Logan's Run, Beneath the Planet of the Apes, Silent Running, The Andromeda Strain, and Colossus the Forbin Project. And this will include spoilers for all of those movies, so just be aware of that. And I'm joined by 3 guests. So first up, we've got Andrea Kail, making her 29th appearance on the show. She's a graduate of the Odyssey Writers Workshop, and her short fiction appears in the Writers of the Future anthology, Fantasy Magazine, and Lightspeed. She's been a television writer, producer, and script supervisor for shows such as Late Night with Conan O'Brien, The Chew, and WWE's Monday Night Raw and Friday Night SmackDown, and she's currently a writer for Pixelberry Studios. So Andrea, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me, Dave.
Then next up, we've got Matthew Kressel, also making his 29th appearance on the show. His novel Queen of Static, the follow-up to his groundbreaking novel King of Shards, is available now, and he recently launched a newsletter of writing advice at outerdeep.substack.com. Together with Ellen Datlow, he hosts the monthly Fantastic Fiction reading series in New York City. So Matt, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Dave. Good to be back.
And also joining us today is Tom Gerencer, making his 27th appearance on the show. His short fiction appears in magazines such as Galaxy's Edge, and in books such as New Voices in Science Fiction. He's the author of the business book Think Like Google, and the short story collection Intergalactic Refrigerator Repairmen Seldom Carry Cash, and his popular science book How It's Made, written for the Discovery Channel, is out now. So Tom, welcome to the show.
Happy to be back, Dave. Thanks for having me.
Okay, so let's start off with Andrea, and have you tell us about your history watching Logan's Run.
Well, I remember watching this a lot when I was a kid and being kind of obsessed with it. Maybe probably because I had a crush on Michael York. Although I was really young, I don't know why I would have a crush on Michael York. But yeah, I watched it a lot when I was a kid. But for some reason, I never remember the end. So the end was actually kind of a surprise for me. Mm-hmm. But I always remember the scene, the carousel, and the renew and the robot in the ice cave. But yeah, it was a movie I watched quite a bit when I was a kid.
Yeah, so I guess I'll explain. So the premise of this is basically we're in the future, and we at least initially think that the Earth has been ecologically destroyed to the point that nobody can live outside. And there's one human settlement that we know of, which is this sort of utopian/dystopian society that lives in kind of this big domed shopping mall kind of complex. And because they have limited space, they have this system where when somebody turns 30, they basically sacrifice themselves for the good of society and a new person is born to replace them. But as Andrea was alluding to, there's this sort of carousel thing, which the people in this society believe is some way that they could potentially, it's like a lottery that you could somehow not die. I'm a little vague on the details of exactly how that was supposed to work.
I think it's you're reborn as a new person.
So like your soul goes into one of the new babies or something?
Something like that, yeah.
I don't know.
That was my takeaway from it.
Okay. Well, you've watched this way more times apparently than I have. So, but how about Matt? Is that correct? Is my understanding of this correct as far as you can tell?
Completely wrong. No, I'm just kidding. Yeah, I mean, I understood, like, I think you're led to believe that there was some kind of apocalypse in the outside world and that humanity's retreated into these dome cities. And it's kind of what you would first think might be like sort of hedonistic pseudo-utopia. And then you slowly come to realize that, oh no, once you turn 30, they're basically just killing everybody. It reminded me actually of Arthur C. Clarke has a novel called The City and the Stars. And there's a similar premise where there's like a city of humans living in a dome, and they are in fact reborn. They're like, consciousness is frozen in a computer for like 1,000 years, and then they come back later as the same person with the same memories. But I think in this case, it's like, it becomes clear fairly early on that nobody is being reborn. This is just their way of making sure that they don't get overpopulated.
Mm-hmm. And so is this a movie that you watched a lot growing up, or do you have any nostalgic attachment to it?
So I think I was a flicker. I mean, like I used to always just really change channels and like sometimes try to watch like two things at once. So I feel like I saw parts of this film, but never the whole thing through until maybe I was in my 20s or early 30s. And like Andrea, I always seem to forget the ending. Like I remember the carousel very clearly, and I have very vivid memories of them leaving the city and, you know, walking around Washington, D.C. and just the haunting image of like, you know, the Washington Monument and the Lincoln Memorial. But like after that, it just sort of gets fuzzy in my mind. But I did rewatch it, I don't know, a decade or two ago, and I did remember it after that. But I did have pretty fond memories of this. I think I also, you know, as a young boy, I thought that the women in this were very, very pretty. I was
Farrah Fawcett is in it.
Farrah Fawcett and
definitely, it seems like a utopian society. If you're
utopian society, there's lots of you know, mutual sex going on, and you know, but I think actually when I first saw this, I was probably even like, you know, too young to even appreciate that. I was just like, oh wow, cool futuristic society, and I love their guns for some reason. Just the way that like the flames shoot out the side as like
so bizarre.
You know, a 10-year-old boy. I'm like, that's so cool.
It's funny now that you mentioned it, I hadn't thought about this, but this did kind of predict Tinder, you know, where you just sort of,
right?
Yeah.
But you
Swipe
put yourself
right
in the circuit. Yeah, really. Yeah.
Yeah, because in this society, you sort of like, you just sort of dial up a sex date for the evening, and it's kind of random. And you can, I guess you can go through a couple and pick one you like or something. But yeah, so it's sort of like Tinder.
The one thing I will say is just that I thought it was you know, for its time, it was a little forward thinking in terms of, you know, there was like a couple people that were like, oh, do you prefer women? And then there was like a man in the circuit who's like, are you interested? And he's like, oh, maybe later. You know, like it wasn't like, oh my God, you know, you know, it was just like, they were like, yeah, that in this society, that's fine. And I was like, I respect that for a movie that came out in 1976, you know?
Mm-hmm. But so Tom, what's your history with Logan's Run?
I thought I had seen it, but when I started watching it, I realized I had never seen it. I had seen that there was a television show spinoff, and I had seen that growing up. Like episodes of it would be on all the time, and the TV show always bothered me because it was just people running around in hallways. And so I never really liked that, and I thought I wasn't going to like this, and I actually didn't And so how I came away from it is I thought Logan's Run is basically a richly imagined future where beautiful young people spend their time riding around in poorly rendered trams, touching old men and throwing each other at cats. And the plot really came together for me when Michael York says, most of this made sense until we met that low budget robot. And this prompts him to tell the female lead, look, nobody's going to pay to see this movie unless you take your clothes off. And she quickly agrees. And then the movie builds to a rousing climax where York observes that Abraham Lincoln is old. And after that, there's some mildly interesting denouement where everybody cheers after York destroys the city by moaning.
Pretty much, yeah.
So I'm sorry. It sounded like you guys really liked it. And I really...
No.
Wait, no, we didn't get into our opinions yet.
Well, let me say, I mean, I have a certain amount of nostalgic attachment to this movie because I saw it as a kid, and really the only thing that stuck in my mind from seeing it as a kid. Okay, so the plot is that there are these policemen sort of called Sandmen, and their job is to hunt down and kill anyone in the city who doesn't show up at the appointed time for the carousel, ceremony thing. And so then the supercomputer that runs the city assigns our main character, Logan, to pretend to be one of these runners and infiltrate them to find out where their sanctuary is, that they're all the refugees are escaping to. And so they have these crystals in their hands that show how close they are, how old they are, basically, how close they are to having to report for carousel duty. And so he says, well, nobody's going to believe that I'm a runner because I'm years away from this. And they change the color of the jewel in his hand to make it look like he's about to die. And he says, will I get my years back? And the computer is ominously silent. And I think that's a great moment, and that's the thing that stuck with me as a kid, that him just asking, will I get my years back, and getting no reply.
Right. That I thought all of that was cool. Everything you just said, the whole setup in that moment, I thought all of that was amazing. And then I stopped watching right there and started watching again the next night, thinking like, this movie's awesome. And then from then on, it just kind of
you're right. It is. It's the setup is great.
Well,
and then it just falls off the edge of the...
Yeah, let me just say, and then I rewatched it like 20 years ago, and all that I really remember from that was that how stupid I thought it was when they get outside and like everything's basically fine, and it's like, why are they living in this city if everything's fine outside?
Yeah.
And I thought the movie basically ended like, I think Matt and maybe Andrea were saying, I basically remembered it ending as soon as they get outside. And so then as soon as on this watch, I was like, wait, that's halfway through the movie. There's a whole other half of the movie that just made no impression on my mind whatsoever.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Because nothing really happens.
The whole scene, or the whole several scenes in the Capitol building, it's just like this long, dragged out conversation with Peter Ustinov, and it's like super boring.
Yeah, and he's quoting T.S. Eliot, and it's like, what is happening?
Oh, is he? Is he really?
Yeah, all this stuff about the cats, that's all T.S.
It's from
Eliot.
the musical Cats,
Well, yeah.
Oh, that's kind of cool.
But yeah, so I totally agree that, like, the second half of this movie is really super forgettable. But I think it has... Yeah, I think we're all pretty much in agreement that it's got sort of great ideas.
Yeah.
And just... like the world building makes no sense.
Yeah.
Like why did the resistance, why are they sending people onto the sanctuary that they've apparently never seen and doesn't exist and is actually there's this killer robot that's like freezing it just like none of this stuff holds together at all.
Yeah.
So I don't know.
And the ending is just ridiculous too. Just like
it's that old you break the computer by giving it a question that it can't answer, which is ridiculous. It's like, well, maybe Sanctuary doesn't exist. The computer's like, no, it has to exist. And then the world blows up and everybody's happy ever after.
Everybody's happy when their city blows up that they've lived in their whole lives. They're like,
and they're all going to starve to death.
And they're like, look, an old... Yeah, because none of them have done a single day's labor.
They have no idea how to survive outside of that city. So what are they going to do?
Right.
Yeah, it's like the end of WALL-E.
Yeah. So I think that, like, obviously, it seems indisputable to me that this movie makes no logical sense at all. But it has a lot of cool like ideas. I mean, they're mostly sort of familiar ideas, but they're still cool. And like it has a certain sort of visual flair and sort of style to it.
Yeah.
It definitely borrowed a lot, I think, from was Star Wars before this or after this?
Right after.
Right after.
79 is Star
Interesting.
Wars.
I thought it was 77.
77.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right.
So I feel like some of the uniforms, like Michael York at times, like if you squint, he sort of looks like Luke Skywalker in Return of the Jedi. You know, I mean, obviously
that's the black
later.
outfit. Yeah.
Yeah. And there was just something about
hair.
it. I guess it was sort of the 70s science fiction aesthetic. Yeah. Like the first, I guess half of the film, I'm like riveted by it. And then as soon as they get outside and then they meet the old man, I mean, there must have been like 20 or 30 minutes of them just talking to him and these cats leaping around. And I was like, oh my God, this is.
Yeah. And they learn nothing. Like they learn nothing. Like you expect to find out what happened. Right. Nothing.
There was one affecting moment where they're walking through a cemetery. And they're like, what are these? Yeah. What are these names? Because they've never seen anyone like die other than through carousel and be honored that way. And that was, I thought that was affecting. And
that was cool.
You know, and I think that there was some power in them seeing an old man for the first time. And she's like, your wrinkles on your face, do they hurt? And then he's like, huh. And then there's this touching moment where, you know, she caresses his face and he flinches because it's like he hasn't had another human being touch him, you know, in decades. And that I thought worked, but the whole scene there, I think, goes on way too long.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, there was good stuff contrasting, you know, or having, you know, seeing our society basically from the point of view of their society. There was some good sci-fi stuff in there. And like, there's a scene where they're like fleeing through this like sex club kind of thing that I thought was like kind of visually interesting, not just because of the nudity, but it was like, you know, it was all like sort of psychedelic and I don't know.
There's a lot of psychedelic in these 70s movies.
Yeah, but I can't handle that stuff. I saw too much of that as a kid.
Yeah. And there was also, go ahead.
Oh, I just feel like there's just a degree to which in the 70s, like every director was trying to be an auteur, even for sort of a dumb-ish sci-fi flick like this one.
Yeah. I was wondering in that scene, if it was supposed to be that they were having like involuntary orgasms as they were running through because they kept kind of stopping and going, oh, and getting like stunned. And I was like, well, they can't just be doing that because there's like a beautiful, you know, person of the whatever sex they choose in front of them. They're just suddenly like incapacitated for like 5 seconds.
I think there was like supposed to be aphrodisiac drugs in the air or something.
That's
and they were just getting pulled into like these orgies.
Yeah.
So, but there was a scene where they're fleeing and there's an older woman, I forget the actress's name, but she's like
Linda something.
Lara Lindsay.
Lara Lindsay, that's it. Yeah.
Yeah, and she's like, "Oh no, I'm young. Look at me." And then she's very clearly over 30 and it's like I just thought it was like there's a comment on like aging. It's like, "Oh, you know, you're over 30. You're no longer worth anything to society." Yeah. And I just that part of it I think is affecting
and relevant these days.
Yeah, right.
It seems like today it drives me crazy how every movie has to have, you know, the brilliant scientist who's like the smartest person in the world is like 17. They always, you know, they've got zero experience, but they're somehow like the on top of their field. And they've got to do that with every movie these days. Like when they remade The Thing, like all of them are just super young.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Well, let's come back to that when we talk about the Andromeda Strain, because that was one of the things I wanted to mention. But just to wrap up Logan's run, I mean, I just wanted to mention there's like a shot where he's walking in front of these banks of computers, and it's like red, yellow, something or whatever.
Clocks.
Yeah, green.
Clocks.
Yeah,
it's like, and it's really, I mean, there's like, like again, there's this visual flair to the movie, and I don't know if you guys saw there's been like talk of remaking this, and like some of the people that have come and gone. Wait, I had a list here. Like Bryan Singer, Christopher McQuarrie, Alex Garland, and Ken Levine, who was basically the creator of the BioShock games. Like, I think, you know, somebody like that, especially Alex, I would love to see Alex Garland's Logan's run. reimagining, where you could take some of these interesting ideas and visuals and actually put a coherent story behind them.
Yeah. No, that would be great. That's one of the things I was thinking too, is that like, I'm surprised nobody's rebooted this yet. We're in the age of rebooting everything.
Right.
You know,
how well is Logan's Run known to people who
under 40? Probably
right.
Not well.
That's what I'm saying. That's probably a main reason. Yeah.
Yeah, it's only us over 30 types.
Yeah.
us irrelevant people.
Yeah.
That remember
Carousel,
renew.
But
Somebody else recently I saw was quoting the robot line, the plankton from the sea.
That
which
was awesome.
Yeah. Somebody else, I think maybe on Twitter, somebody was referencing it, and then, they were like, do you know what I'm talking about? And most people don't.
So yeah, I mean, maybe not the most significant movie of all time, but enough. Like, again, just that one scene where he says, well, I get my years back. That's enough for me to say, like, this is kind of like a movie that's worth thinking about.
So
that was cool.
Just a point that I want to come back to later is I feel like a lot of these movies that we watch, these 5, I see later films steal so much from it.
Oh yeah. And
So-
books too, even books. Like a lot of the Hitchhiker's Guides trilogy stole stuff from several
Dwarf.
of these movies.
Yeah, there's that scene where they discover the little girl hiding among the ruins, and I'm like, oh, it's Newt
Aliens.
from
I was just,
Aliens.
exactly.
And I'm like,
It looked
that-
exactly like her.
Yeah, like down to the hair color, the expressions. Yeah.
Well, the Michael Bay movie, The Island, is more or less a remake of Logan's Run, in my opinion.
Yeah.
But these several movies you had us watch, though, Dave, are also borrowing heavily from Star Trek, the original series. There was a lot of stuff that showed up
Visually,
from
yeah.
that. And thematically, and some of the ideas as well.
Well, I was thinking as I'm watching them, most of these movies are message movies.
Yeah.
Not just straight up adventure, but they're messages. And I'm not saying that in a good way, because they tend to be a little preachy, some more than others. But yeah.
Well, I mean, yeah, maybe let's come back to that if we have time at the end. But I'll just say quickly, I mean, like, people who sort of came of age in the 70s often will say that Star Wars kind of ruined everything, because before that, science fiction movies were, serious and thoughtful and, dealt with serious political issues and stuff. And then Star Wars kind of made everything just about entertainment.
But see, from my point of view, I think the exact opposite. Star Wars made them interesting.
Yeah.
It made them adventures, as opposed, you can make a message movie and make it good. These are not good message movies.
Right. That's what I was going to say. Like, a lot of these, like, they have, the message, I guess, is important, but the way it's delivered is so, like, preachy and heavy-handed that it doesn't have, like, the narrative to drive it along. Whereas, like, I mean, obviously Star Wars does not have a message, I don't think, but, like, Terminator has this, it's like, yeah.
All right. Well, before we get too far off track, so so speaking of bad message movies, I think that brings us to Beneath the Planet of the Apes. So
I thought you were going to go elsewhere with that, but okay.
Yeah,
I did too. Big time.
Okay, interesting. Well, you're suggesting there was another movie on this list you thought I was gonna.
Yes,
absolutely. I'm curious if we all three of us think it was the same one.
I think so.
I think so.
All right. Well, let's start off with Beneath the Planet of the Apes. So this is the first sequel of many to the classic Planet of the Apes, starring Charlton Heston. So I thought I had seen this before, but now having watched it, I think I haven't. I think I just watched the sort of cartoon adaptation as a kid enough times that I thought I had actually watched the original movie. So this was my first time. So had anybody seen this previously?
I had.
Many times when I was a kid, and I always seemed to be home from school sick with strep throat. So I conveniently came down with strep throat right before I watched this again as an adult. I could still hear it in my voice. And so I felt like I was thrown back in time to my parents' couch watching this.
Nice.
So Tom, you said that you thought that this was going to be a turd. I think that's your exact quote.
Yeah, and I've sounds like I'm going to go against the grain here, but I had such maybe because my expectations were so low from what I remembered, I actually really liked this, and I think so. The only thing I remembered about it was the final scene, which we can do spoilers, right?
Yeah,
the final scene where everybody dies, including everybody in the whole world dies.
And it's just people on Earth, to be fair.
Well, that's true. Yeah. And it's very abrupt. It's like everything's going, what's going to happen? And now the planet is dead. And then the credits come up and you're like, okay.
Yeah,
and I remember that's the only thing I remember from the movie. And I hated it. I hated that they ended things that way, and I still do. But going back and watching this again, knowing that that was coming, I was like, this movie has a lot going for it. It has a solid plot. Things don't get stagnated anywhere. There's no boring scenes. There's really cool images of like the Library of Congress, like sunk down underneath the ground, and an old subway station, and like a city bus stuck in like a solidified magma flow, and like a lot of really cool images and cool concepts in the movie that I ended up liking it a lot.
Yeah, it's like every New York City landmark somehow ended up in the same.
Yeah, the New York Stock Exchange was up by the library, which by Radio City. I was like, wait, those things are way far apart.
Right. Well, things moved in the apocalypse.
Okay,
that's pretty far to move.
I will say though, Tom, I mean, I don't know if it's just because I watched the cartoon as a kid, but what you're saying, this idea in the movie of like the mutant humans living in the subway, the ruined subway tunnels with all the New York City monuments with psychic powers, worshiping a nuclear bomb, like has a weird emotional power to me. So, I don't know I guess, Matt, you agree with that?
It does. It reminded me of Canticle for Leibowitz. So it's like the sort of remnants of civilization and the survivors don't really understand the context of what they're worshiping. And, so the mutant survivors that have somehow developed telepathy worship a nuclear bomb. And it's not just any nuclear bomb. It's the Alpha and Omega bomb, which is basically a planet killer. And it's gold somehow.
Yeah.
And they all worship it, which I actually found really haunting. Like there's something about their singing, and then when they reveal their faces, that they pull it off, and it's I think you're just supposed to be really horrified that they're oh my God, look how ugly they are. They must be evil. And then like I think from today's point of view, it's like, oh no, like we should feel sorry for them. Like they've been through hell. And but I don't think that the director necessarily wanted you to feel that way about them. I think the director wanted you to be horrified by them. Yeah. Which was an interesting point of view. But yeah, like visually it was really cool. I love the like I actually think for its time the special effects were pretty good, like in terms of like the ape faces and the way they did like Grand Central Station, and it was entertaining in the sense that it had a better pacing than some of the other movies we watched for this, but
well, so I thought the second half was way better than the first half. Yeah,
and I like. I love that they did a Rogue One ending where they were just like, fuck it, we're going to kill everybody. And I was like, I appreciate that. I really appreciate that. Cause I think that, the tendency these days is to just like drag everything on. But of course they do that with this series, but,
yeah.
So Andrea, beneath the Planet of the Apes.
Well, I loved all the Planet of the Apes movies when I was a kid. I used to sit and watch them. They would have, marathons. I would watch them with my brother. We would, my brother was the one who introduced me to all things science fiction, movies, books. So I have a very soft spot in my heart. And I remember liking this just because, I was a kid. You don't think about quality of movies. You just like a good adventure story. This is the first time I'd seen it in, I couldn't even tell you how long, at least 25, 30 years. It's bad. But it's, it's still got that fun, silly 70s quality to it that I enjoy. Yeah, I'm sitting at the end going, well, Queensboro Plaza is not anywhere near Grand Central Station. It doesn't lead there. There are no circular tunnels. The stock exchange is not near the library in Radio City. And how did even a nuclear bomb? How did the nuclear bomb change East Coast rocky granite coasts and geology to Southwest sandstone and buttes? It just didn't make any damn sense at all.
So I started watching this movie and I was astounded that Charlton Heston returned for this.
Yes.
And then it turned out he really didn't.
But he was. What do you mean?
Well, did you? Okay, so
I did not look it up.
So they begged him to be in the sequel, and he didn't want to be in the sequel. And finally, he agreed, as long as his character had to die, so they couldn't come back to him again. And he would only be in the movie for like 12 minutes or something like that.
Yeah. It's very clear that he didn't want to be in this. Yeah. And then so they cast someone who
looks
like a similar archetype.
But it's so disturbing when they're standing face to face. The other guy is like 1/3 his size or something.
Yeah.
It looks like a giant next to like a mini me or something like that.
And so that's the big problem with this movie to me, is that basically the entire first half is like, you remember Planet of the Apes? Well, here it is again.
Yeah.
Except like shitty.
Yeah.
Yeah, the movie's obviously so bad that the first 10 minutes of this movie are gonna be the last 10 minutes of the last movie.
And they also had the Brent, what a name, Brent, say the same line on the beach.
Yeah,
they did it. They actually did it.
Right.
It's like, you couldn't come up with something else.
So I mean, but So to the extent that I feel like this is almost a better movie without the Planet of the Apes stuff in it. The stuff that the non-Planet of the Apes stuff is more interesting to me than the stuff that carried over from the first movie.
But I agree with you. But I think that Star Trek: The Original Series did it better, because with the menagerie, like that which came before this movie, that the episode I'm talking about, where
the original pilot, right?
The original pilot.
Oh, right.
It was the same. It was the same setup. It wasn't this is the Earth actually, but it was, these people can control things with their minds. They can make you see or do whatever they want. And how are you going to get away? How are you going to beat them? And it was like the same thing. It was like watching. I was like, oh, that's where you guys got that from. You got it from
they totally didn't use any of their powers to fight the apes. Like, what are you doing?
No, there was some throwaway line where they were like, oh, the apes are too stupid. We can't use our powers on them. But it was like,
that makes no sense.
You can make them see stuff, but you can't make them feel pain, I guess. That's kind of, I don't know.
But I do feel like it was a running issue with a lot of these 70s movies that somehow they had not figured out how to make the ending of a movie feel like the ending of a movie, where just the credits start playing. You're like, wait, what? That totally blindsided me.
They don't end, they stop.
Yes.
Right.
Like all of them, pretty much. Almost.
They haven't learned plot arcs.
Yeah,
they really
or
haven't.
Plot, really.
Yeah.
Well, but it's even like not even to me. To my mind, it's not even so much a plot problem. It's just like it's like at some point they figured out, okay, to make the movie feel like it's over, you have to have some long panning shot away from something, and with music, to let cue the audience that you're about to end the movie, and they just hadn't figured that out yet or something at this point. But yeah, I don't know. Any other thoughts on Beneath the Planet of the Apes?
Terrible fight scenes.
Yeah, it was. Yeah, that's another thing they got from Star Trek.
Yeah.
I liked the actor who played the ape general. He was from Barney Miller. That's the only, I could hear his voice was so iconic, and I was like, this like amiable, overweight cop.
Yep.
I hear him in that ape every time he speaks.
I know there's like 20 other Planet of the Apes movies. I watched some of the newer ones, The Rise of the Planet of the Apes. I watched the first two.
The ones made in the 90s?
Yeah.
Yeah, they're terrible too.
Possibly even later than, it must be later than, I think it was the 2000s that they started coming out. But
Andy Serkis.
But Andrea, should I continue? Like, how did they continue the series after they blew up the Earth in this movie?
Well, here's how they do this. So the next movie is escape the Planet of the Apes, I think. And it has Cornelius and Zira getting in a spaceship and going back in time to Earth, from whence Taylor and Brent came, and becoming like circus sideshow people.
It's horrible.
It's awful. And then she's pregnant, and she gives birth to a baby who also can speak. And then they're taken, and I guess, can I spoil it? Does anybody give a shit?
Oh, please spoil it.
They're killed, I think. And the baby is taken by Ricardo Montalban, who's a circus, who owns a circus, and is brought up in the circus, but he can speak. And so he learns how to be, that's how he escapes. And he learns, he learns how to be a human. And then that's how that ends. Zira and Cornelius die and their baby escapes. And then the next one after that is another dystopia where all the animals on the planet have died, all the cats and dogs. So people have adopted, the baby's name, the Cornelius and Zira's baby's name is Caesar.
I remember
and he somehow teaches all the other apes how to speak, and now people in this dystopian future have now taken apes who speak as like slaves, essentially, although they're supposed to be pets, but they're slaves. And Caesar, the baby of Zira and Cornelius, leads a revolt, and that's how the apes become dominant.
Man, you've really watched these.
I have watched all of them, yeah. I have totally watched all of them.
And there was also like the remakes about 10 years ago, right?
Yeah, those are the terrible ones. They were bad too, but in their own way.
So that makes it's kind of a cool loop when you think about it. Like that's how it's kind of like a Back to the Future thing. That's how they originally got there, as they went back in time from the future.
Right.
All right. I don't know if I'm going to watch any of those based on that description. But
yeah.
I had to watch them all when I was a kid just because my older brothers were watching them. When you said we had to watch this one, I was like, oh, not that. I thought I'd never have to watch. It's like you told me I had to go in another nursing home the rest of my life. I'd be like, no, please, I don't ever want to.
I thought I was going to enjoy it as more than I did because I thought it was going to be like a real, nostalgic thing. But it just,
I loved it. Has anyone ever seen the cartoon? I loved the cartoon.
I remember.
Yes, I remember.
No, I just flicking by.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. So anyway, that was Planet of the Apes, and so next I want to bring up Silent Running, which I have a sneaking suspicion maybe.
Maybe.
The film
Ding, 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 ding.
some of you were alluding to earlier.
Love the message, hate the movie.
Yeah.
Well, so this movie is always I had never seen this before, but this movie has always had this kind of legendary status for me because my parents, when they were in graduate school, they went out to a drive-in movie theater and they watched Soylent Green and Silent Running. And then they were so depressed. There were a couple other movies, and they just came home.
That should have clued you right there.
Yeah.
And they were so depressed that they signed up for like the Sierra Club and stuff like that to try to avert the horrible futures.
Well, I mean, I guess the message worked then, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I've always thought that was kind of a cool, example of how science fiction could, actually influence the world. But I'd never seen the movie before. Had anybody else ever seen this before?
No, never seen it.
Yes,
I haven't. No.
I had, and I really didn't want to watch it again, but thank you. But no, I watched it. I've mentioned several times my older brother who was like, "Oh, you have to watch this movie." And he doesn't really strike me as like a science fiction person, but then every one of these movies, I'm like, "Yeah, my older brother told me I had to watch it."
Yeah.
So like I watched it, and I was like, "This movie, like I get like I grew up in that time period. I get the drive for like we were watching." Industrialization do basically what it's continued to do now, getting worse and worse and worse. And we had a lot of voices back then saying, no, we have to stop this. And rightly so, it was some bad things being done. But then you had a lot of this kind of movie with like the high pitched trilling soundtrack, like the woman singing.
Joan Baez.
Yep.
Was that Joan Baez?
Yes,
Yep.
It was. Yeah.
Oh my gosh.
All of it.
Okay. Well, she's famous, but in this movie, I'm just like I can't stand that voice. You picture her wearing a flower print dress in a field of daisies somewhere with feathered hair. and I, I grew up around hippies when I was a kid. There were so many. I grew up in Maine in the 1970s, and it was like hippies were everywhere. And this movie is just watching Bruce Dern like agonize, the sensitive murderer, introspective murderer. Yeah. I'm just like, it makes sense why you had to kill those people. I get it, but then watching him agonize over it.
Well, let me just explain for listeners if you haven't seen the movie. So what happens is that we're in the future, and I get the impression there is no trees left on Earth somehow.
Right. Yeah.
And the only trees that still exist are on these sort of like biosphere, domed structures on spaceships in the general vicinity of Saturn, I think. And there's like 7 or something of these ships. And the call comes in that we don't care about these trees anymore, just jettison them, blow them up, and come back. And, we want these ships for commercial enterprises. And our main character, played by Bruce Dern, is a botanist or something who, loves these trees. And so he sort of goes AWOL and ends up killing his 3 crewmates and absconding with the trees. Is that, I don't know. Is that it?
Yeah.
That's the plot. It's a cool premise, I gotta say.
So Matt, you'd never seen this, but what was your impression watching this for the first time?
I had never seen this before. So if you pitch this to me, like the premise of it, like I love, space and space science, and I'm a total environmentalist, I would have been like, oh my God, that sounds great. This movie is just excruciating to watch.
Yeah.
Just Bruce Dern's expressions, like just mugging at the camera.
Oh my gosh, the scenery chewing.
And it's so like over the top ridiculous. I'm like, well, you have to spoof this. Like you have and as I'm watching this, I'm like, oh my God, that's what Red Dwarf is. It's like this guy alone on a spaceship with nothing but droids to hang out with. So like, yeah, like the long, there's like 2 or 3 interludes where Joan Baez is just like singing, and then there's like music in the trees, and it's like, I don't know if I want to laugh and cry, and oh man. So yeah, it's like the pacing in this is so ridiculously slow. There's like these long scenes where he's just playing poker with robots.
I know.
And I'm horrible. Like, what is the tension here? What is the, I thought, so, okay. So what happens is he gets the order to blow up the biodomes, and they have to eject them from the ship and nuke them. And instead of nuking them, he kills his partners and flies off alone. And then, so like the other ships start looking for him, and he does this like weird maneuver around Saturn to evade them. And I was like, oh, that's what this is going to be. It's going to be him trying to outrun them. But like, he just kind of does that. And then the movie keeps going. And I'm like, oh, well, what's going to happen next? And nothing actually happens next.
Well, it does happen. Then he's like, oh, I guess I just have to kill myself.
Right.
Which,
there's the tragic deaths of Huey, Dewey, and Louie.
Yeah.
Huey, Dewey, and
Louie. That
yeah.
was the one interesting part of the movie.
One of them died, but the other thing is like the big revelation. Like the revelation. Okay, so very late in the movie, the plants start dying, and I'm like, okay, if you're gonna have like the plants start dying, like you should have it sooner, right? Because that, like, he's a botanist, that would be a challenge for him. So it takes him like forever to realize, oh, it's the sun.
The sun.
Yeah.
I'm like, you're out at Saturn. You're a fucking botanist. Like, this is your job. Your one job, and you can't figure out it's the sun. He's like, oh, we can solve it by adding more light. And then not only does he like, so you're like, oh, okay, he rigs up a bunch of like shitty spotlights.
Yeah.
It's like it looks like they're when there's like a fire and like the fire trucks come in with the spotlights, like that's what it was like, or like some oh, we're gonna paint the wall, can I borrow your spotlight for a night? It's just, I was like, that's gonna keep like
a forest alive. It was, I literally was like, you're kidding me. That's it? The sun?
Yeah. And, parts of it I was like, oh, that's cool. You know, it's like American Airlines owns this spaceship, and there was like all these
That
kind
was
of
cool.
cool crates in the back. Like, but then like the actual biodomes, it just looked like a shitty set, and I'm like, you know, why couldn't they do the Star Trek thing where it's like, you know, you film it in an actual forest and say, oh, it's an alien world. So why couldn't they film it in an actual forest and say, oh, we're under the biodome, and then just do a close shot and you would never know.
Right.
But it's just like, it literally looks like they just like took a sound stage and threw a bunch of dirt. And
I read that was a budget thing. They talked about that in the Wikipedia article. I mean, the kind of interesting thing about this movie is that it was directed by Douglas Trumbull. This was his directorial debut.
He did the Blade Runner special effects.
He did the special effects. Wait, I have to
did you see who wrote it too?
Well, let me just say about Douglas Trumbull. So he did the special effects for 2001: A Space Odyssey, Close Encounters of the Third Kind, Star Trek: The Motion Picture, and Blade Runner.
Mm-hmm. Wow.
But so sorry. Go ahead about the who.
Do you know who?
Did
you see who wrote it?
No.
So the two writers. There's 3 writers on it. One of them is Michael Cimino, who wrote Deer Hunter.
Oh, wow.
And Derek Washburn, who is also wrote Deer Hunter with him. And Michael Cimino won multiple Academy Awards for many movies. And then the third writer is Stephen Bochco of Hill Street Blues fame, the biggest 80s producer of shows, you know, one of the biggest producers in the 80s of hit shows. So these are not this is like the amateur outing of 3 of the biggest writers of the 80s.
Yeah,
and it's shocking how terrible it is.
They just needed some work and decided to phone it in, or
clearly they needed 10 years and then they became, you know, Cimino won I don't know how many Academy Awards. Stephen Bochco ruled the 80s television. It's shocking.
Well, maybe this was a learning process for them.
I'll say, I mean, it sounds like you guys all just despise this movie. I thought it was really boring, but I feel like pretty much all 70s movies are really boring. And
that's not fair.
Brings back to mind memories of being a kid and just always falling asleep in front of whatever, you know, TV show or movie was on. So that didn't strike me as much. I mean, and I thought like Bruce Dern was all right. I mean, like this whole movie is basically you're watching him talking to himself.
Yeah.
And I thought, considering that's what the movie is, I thought he did a creditable job of carrying the movie.
But you know what I was thinking as I was watching it? If I'm interrupting you, I'm sorry.
No, go ahead.
I was thinking of Moon.
Yeah,
which is basically the same setup.
I was just going to say that.
But it's
I don't like that movie either.
You don't like Moon?
No, I just don't like movies where there's science fiction movies where there's one person in front of the camera the whole time. It just bothers me.
See, but I was just going to say Moon knows how to do it.
Yeah.
Okay.
Moon really knows how to do it. How to make it interesting and how to it has a plot and a point. I mean, it has a plot and a satisfying arc and an ending. But it also shows him going crazy in a credible way. And he's got, you know, he's a charismatic actor. I can't remember his name.
Sam Rockwell.
Sam Rockwell.
Yeah,
yes.
that's him.
And he has something to do and he has a point. You can see it's got a plot. This movie does not have a plot. Moon has a plot, but it's the same setup of a guy alone in space.
Yeah.
You know?
Yes, but Bruce Dern has a hawk, so
yeah, right, and a caftan,
right.
That's right.
Let me also, I don't know if you guys know this. So the robots in this, which apparently were done by what's it? I think it's from bilateral amputees. I think it's people who have had their legs removed.
I was wondering how they did that.
And so they're just kind of walking around on their arms, you know, I guess on stilts or something.
Are you serious? Wow.
Yeah.
Yeah, because it looked like very human-like the way they moved. And
yes.
I was like, oh, I wonder if it's little people.
But so George Lucas watched this movie.
Sorry. I was going to say, I have a note that says here that look like Star Wars robots.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And so he went to Ralph McQuarrie, the concept artist for Star Wars, and he says, I want one robot that looks like the robot from Fritz Lang's Metropolis, and I want one robot that looks like the robots from Silent Running.
Nice.
So
nice,
interesting bit of history.
So
there.
R2D2 we have because of this.
Yeah.
All right. At least something good came out.
yeah, right.
But all
and your
the
parents
other
joining Sierra Club.
yeah, they also look like the robots like on the Death Star in the original Star Wars.
Oh, those like little
the little garbage looking ones.
Yeah.
So the way they're kind of trapezoidal
Yeah.
on top.
Mhm.
Yeah.
So yeah, any other thoughts on Silent Running before we move on?
I don't have any thoughts on that movie at all.
Yeah.
Well, there is a theme among all of these movies that it's just kind of a warning of the dangers of where humanity's headed as a society, whether it's nuclear war or environmental catastrophe, which I think we're still there.
Yeah,
we're still at both of those, like full court press. I think, and I think you're right. I think both of these movies do have a really good tie-in to the science fiction as a warning, type of thing.
Yeah, and again, like solid premise. I mean, I think you could totally make a riveting movie with this premise. It's just, this isn't it. But
one more thought: the world building you mentioned for Logan's Run, the world building for this. Why do they all carry nukes? We would have put a bunch of nukes on this in case we ever want to blow up these forests.
Everybody in the future has nukes. Come on.
Good point.
Nuke.
Good point.
Pocket nuke.
Right.
Well,
they were small.
That actually
Second
brings us to
Amendment.
our next movie, Andromeda Strain. So I had never seen this before, but I read the book when it came out, and I didn't remember it all that well. I just remembered sort of the basic setup. The basic setup, I guess I'll say, is that there's a town in New Mexico where everybody dies after a government satellite lands there, which has brought back some sort of alien pathogen. And the story concerns the scientists who are tasked with containing and understanding the nature of this alien pathogen. How about Andrea? Had you ever seen this before?
I had never seen it before, and I did not read the book. They made a TV show of it.
Oh,
too,
it's by Michael
somewhere.
Crichton. I guess I don't know if I said that, but the same author as Jurassic Park and stuff like that. Okay, sorry, go ahead.
I had never read it, and I had never seen the movie, but I was aware of it, and they had made a TV show of it a few years ago, and by a few years ago I mean like 15. Which I also had not seen. So I knew it was about some kind of plague, but that's all I knew about it. Mm-hmm. So I came into it with a reasonably clean slate.
So what were your overall impressions of the movie?
Well, to me, it felt like the best movie of the bunch, just in a plot sense, in that, it had a point. It had a goal, and it met the goal, and it didn't just end. And people had stuff to do, and there was a puzzle that they had to figure out. But it also had that odd coldness of an early 70s movie. But I think this goes to Tom's point about all scientists being, young and beautiful. There were actually people who look like scientists in this. Like
no offense to any scientists who might be listening.
Yeah.
Who might be young and beautiful.
Yes, no offense to young, beautiful scientists anywhere. But they looked like real people, which is the joy of 1970s is not everybody was gorgeous. Not everybody had to be beautiful to be a movie star. That was very nice. And, it was intellectual. It was interesting. The whole, the giant cylinder, whatever, different levels of clean rooms was interesting. It didn't have any emotion to it really, but it was interesting.
Well,
that's the best I could say is interesting.
Just explain that. So these scientists get sent to this government lab, which I'm sure bears no resemblance to any facility that actually has ever existed in reality, but is pretty super cool. And this lab is sort of subterranean with multiple levels and has some sort of automatic system where it's going to get blown up with a nuclear bomb in the event of any sort of emergency, unless you 5 minutes turn a key at a particular place.
It's so ridiculous.
So Matt, overall impressions of the Andromeda Strain.
Yeah, so I've seen this one before a few times, and as a kid, I loved it. I think I first encountered this as a teenager, maybe, or younger, and I was just super enamored by the whole kind of scientific rigor. I mean, coming back to it, as an adult, you can see, oh, that's kind of ridiculous. But like as a kid, I was like, oh, they have to go through these levels of decontamination, and then even today, I really found that like their process of elimination to figure out exactly what the pathogen was quite riveting, and it was also horrifying. I hope they didn't kill any animals to
Oh yes,
Oh,
God.
yeah.
No, it says no animals were harmed. During making this movie.
But like the way that they were like, well, let's put the air through a filter at this particular thickness and see how it affects it, and then like where they're looking at under the microscope, and then the thing grows for the first time, and that freaked me the hell out the first time I saw it. Once they get to the sort of bio containment bunker place, I thought the special effects there were actually great. Before that, it was really campy. Like there's this terrible tendency of these 70s and early 80s science fiction films to do these like really bad spacesuits with like tubes coming out of them. It just looks really fake. But like once they get underground, I was like, oh, that's actually decent. And then I thought that they predicted a lot of modern tech. So like with the palm scanner to go into the base, and then where they had the recorded computer voice, and he's like, the scientist is like, oh, who are you? And they're like, oh, it's a recorded voice. She's a 16-year-old woman in Ohio that she, she sells her voice. And I was like, oh, that's kind of like Siri, like when they tracked down Siri. There were other things like that. And one thing that really struck out at me was the scene near the beginning where the two airmen, I guess, are going to the town where the satellite has crashed. And you don't see them. You just hear what they're conveying over the radio. And it's like, oh my God, what's that? Oh my God. And they did it in a way, it was like, it was riveting. And I was immediately reminded of the scene in Close Encounters.
I was going to,
with the air traffic controllers. Where you don't see what the pilots are seeing on the plane. You just hear what they're reporting to air traffic control. And I was like, oh, Spielberg totally stole that. Like he totally stole that from that scene.
But he made it better.
He made it better.
He improved it.
Because Spielberg is a great director.
Yes.
And there was also this, and I felt Spielberg did this in Close Encounters, where there's like less of some scenes, not every scene, but like less of a focus on individual characters, but more on the group. And it almost feels like, I don't want to say improv, but it just feels very natural, because like everyone's sort of talking at once, and what about this? And what about this? And it feels like, oh, you're actually in the room watching people work. And like that part of it really worked for me.
Yeah.
The part where they're like going to each scientist's house and pulling them out of whatever they're doing. Like, no, you need to come with me right now. This is important. I can't tell you what it is, but let's go. And then when they get there and the decontamination process was a little absurd, but I liked it. And then, like I said, the science of it was.
Yeah, let me pick up on that, Matt, because that for me definitely is the strength of this movie. Is you see this group of scientists. So there's a puzzle, because there are two survivors in this town, two survivors of the plague. There's a little baby and an old alcoholic, and then the question is, why did they survive when everybody else died? And I feel like most movies today, like all the scientists would be young and hot, and then they would be like having stupid like chest beating fights with each other, or there'd be like a romance or something. And it's not. It's just like there's these middle-aged scientists. They're all pretty calm and competent, and they're just working in a calm, competent way to try to solve this scientific puzzle that's of such high importance. And I feel like we need more movies like that, and I really liked that's what this one was about. And we'll get back to Tom too. Tom, anything you want to add here?
Yeah, I had seen this movie when I was 8, so I question what you said, Dave, about having read the book when it first came out, because you're like 10 years younger than me, and I think the movie came out after many years after the book, but
I guess that's a good point because the book was 67, so I obviously didn't read it when it first came out. But I feel like at the time I read it is when it got, maybe this is just
when it got popular.
Yeah, I just feel like there was this moment when suddenly everyone was reading Michael Crichton.
Yeah, it was right after
Jurassic
Disclosure.
Park.
No, it was before Jurassic Park. It was right after Disclosure came out. The book Disclosure came out and it was really famous already. And then they made a movie with Michael Douglas. And then that made it even more famous. And then everybody was like, who's this Michael Crichton guy? And they started reading his books. And then Jurassic Park came out a few years later. But Andromeda Strain, I didn't know until Disclosure came out that it was him. And the way I found out was a friend of mine who I grew up with said, hey, that movie Disclosure, he's like, the book was written by this guy, Michael Crichton. He also wrote Andromeda Strain. And then I was like, holy cow, because me and this friend of mine both loved Andromeda Strain. We were like 8 years old. We saw the movie and were blown away by it. And to an 8-year-old, like the science was flawless. And the movie was just super cool. And the whole concept of like the key and like having to climb up this ladder and go to like different levels and try to get to one of the stations where you could turn the key was fascinating. We used to act that out all the time, like climbing trees, be like, duck, and this movie really made an impression on me as a kid. So when you said this was one of the movies we're going to watch, I was really excited to see it again. And I really liked it again. I feel like every shot, the cinematography is amazing. Every shot is like a photo from the old Life magazine. There were some really prescient moments about technology. One of my favorites was when the woman scientist gets really angry at the computer and starts yelling at it, because at that time nobody had ever been angry at voicemail yet. Not voicemail, but one of those automatic voice menu messages.
Yeah.
And she's like yelling at it, like, I said this, ragweed pollen. She gets like all upset at it. And I was like, oh my gosh. I was like, you watch that and you're just like, yeah. But then you think about it and you're like, no, this was like 1971 or whatever. He had to imagine that from scratch.
Yeah.
Nobody had ever felt that emotion before at a computer.
Okay, actually, interesting trivia. Do you know who did the special effects for this?
Trumbull.
Douglas Trumbull.
Interesting.
Clearly, he put his work into this one.
They gave him more of a budget.
Right.
But watching this movie again, I just really liked it again. I thought, I saw some flaws in it. There's a couple of things. It wouldn't survive today as a new movie. There wasn't a big enough, like chase scene at the end with explosions. But to me, as an 8-year-old, it blew me away. And even now, I'd say it's definitely worth watching if you've never seen it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I mean, I think also, talking about message movies, it was like, it wasn't that it just was like an alien pathogen randomly landed on Earth, that the U.S. military was looking in space for bioweapons.
Yeah.
And the actual biohazard containment facility was bioweapon research.
Yes.
And they realized this halfway through and they're like, oh no, that's not why it is. And it's like, oh no, very clearly that's what it is. And it's just like it came to bite humanity on the ass.
Yeah.
And they just happened to get lucky that the virus just mutated to a non-lethal form. Which I thought was kind of a cop-out, but
it is.
It was, but they got there really quickly. I like that they had the puzzle where they figure out like what does a baby, a crying baby who's perfectly healthy, have in common with a 75-year-old sterno drinker? Why is their blood the only blood that this thing can't invade? That was such a cool like setup where they started that right away, where they find the crying baby and they carry it all the way through and they finally figure it out. And it's this moment of triumph. Even again, as an 8-year-old, I remember being like, oh, they figured it out. It's so cool.
And it's just like the solution isn't some like stupid technobabble. It's actually like, oh no, it can only survive between a very narrow pH range.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I was like, that's pretty cool. Like that's not something you'll see in a film today, because they're like, wow, would the general audience understand what a pH range is, and they would just do something else. But I like that they weren't afraid to be scientific, to show like how science works, the process of elimination. Obviously, it's not super accurate, but there was like as an engineer, like as a person who writes software, like I'm like, oh, I love their process of elimination.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I want to say too that this is a 2-hour movie, and it doesn't feel like it. It feels like about an hour and 20 minutes. It goes fast.
Yeah.
All right, cool. Yes, so we should probably move on. I guess I'll say, I mean, that if you look at the suite of movies that I picked, and you look at some of the issues they're dealing with, pandemics, I mean, AI, which we're about to get to, ecological collapse,
nuclear war,
youth culture, nuclear war. Yeah, you would have to say, I mean,
it's very timely.
They did a pretty good job of, honing in on some of the issues that were going to be important.
Clearly, we're terrible at heeding the warnings.
Completely.
Right.
I just want to know why there was just a random shot of a naked hippie girl in there. Anybody?
Oh,
in the Andromeda Strain?
When they
yeah.
When they go to the town.
Yeah.
And I was like, because then people will leave the film and be like, did you catch the nudie scene?
Yeah,
right. And then everybody goes and watches it.
Really? There's a nude scene?
Although it was kind of... It was kind of interesting how that was shot because they're looking in the windows and then
and there's the boxes and I thought that was really visually interesting.
So again with them being
the film?
No, I don't think so.
I think they might have done it once.
Yeah, I think there was one other
researching
part.
I don't know.
Yeah, but again about how people were trying to be in the 70s, trying to be more kind of creative about presentation. It hadn't sort of all gotten,
and I appreciate that.
No,
I love a good split screen.
Yeah. All right, so how about Colossus, the Forbin project? So I'd never seen this one either, but there was a Robert Asprin introduction. Actually, it's the introduction to the Thieves' World, the first Thieves' World anthology that I just read over and over and over again as a kid. And he talks about how, as a joke, one of the contributors jokingly referred to Thieves' World as Colossus the Aspirin Project because it's gotten so out of control. And so again, this was another movie that sort of I'd never seen but had sort of a mythical, feel to me. And so had anyone seen this one previously?
Nope.
Never
even heard of it.
No. All right. Interesting. Yeah. Okay. So about Tom, overall impressions of Colossus, the Forbin project.
I really liked it. I had heard of it before, and I thought it was probably going to be okay, but I really enjoyed it. I thought the pacing was good. There were some quirky, definitely some odd things, like the funny shunted in love story that they stuck in there. It seemed like the director, seemed like the producer wanted that in there and insisted on it or something. It didn't seem to belong, but it was kind of entertaining too. And apart from also the setup of it, where they're like, right at the beginning, they're like, we've built this computer that's going to make all our decisions for it, and no human being can ever touch it. Like, there's no way we can ever interfere. No matter what it does, we can't interfere with it. It's perfect.
That'll go perfectly fine.
Yeah.
I was like, well, what could possibly go wrong? But once you swallow that, which is difficult to swallow, then everything else, you're like, yeah, well, this all makes kind of sense. And it was engaging. I thought the kind of German accented main character held my attention. He was this kind of iconoclast, brilliant scientist, computer guy who like had everything figured out. And then when it starts to go wrong, you can see him kind of, he's not very, he doesn't have a lot of different range of expressions, but you can tell what he's thinking, and you can tell he's like, oh, that sucks, but let me try to put my mind on this and I'll figure it out. And you see him working really hard to figure it out, and you see it going gradually wrong to the point where he's like, I'm not going to be able to figure this out. And the computer is so maddening. Again, there's a couple of quirky things. Like, it's like, oh, it designed the perfect voice for itself. And it's like, oh, I'm this peaceful. I'm here to help you humans. I'm going to make everything better. I might have to take control away from you. I want you to design the perfect voice for me. It's going to be this totally psychopathic robotic voice.
Yeah.
But I thought it was once you swallow the premise, which again was hard, I thought it was a really cool, riveting, and believable movie.
Did you say, I don't know if you said explicitly, Tom, that this was replacing our nuclear arsenal under the control of this?
Yeah.
I didn't get into that, but yeah, that's yeah.
So that's the premise basically, is that they decide, rather than entrust these sorts of decisions to fallible humans who get angry and fearful and, whatever, we're just going to have a machine coldly and logically be making these strategic decisions. You mentioned, you mentioned, Tom, that the main character has a German accent. So his actual name, so his stage name is Eric Braeden, but his real name is Hans Gudegast. And it says Universal Pictures executive Lou Wasserman told him that no one would be allowed to star in an American film if they had a German name. So that's where the Eric Braeden.
I thought they were intentionally riffing off of Werner von Braun.
Yeah. Yeah, I thought that was kind of...
He was just a tall sort of Operation Paperclip scientist. And it's like, let's entrust him with all of our nukes.
Yeah, I mean, it's possible they had that in mind too. Although they originally tried to get Charlton Heston and somebody else, but
that is a very Charlton Heston role.
Yeah.
But so Andrea, overall thoughts on this movie?
Yeah, it was the ridiculous setup. I was first of all, this will mean nothing to anyone but me. But the costume designer was Edith Head, who is one of the most famous costume designers in Hollywood and golden era of Hollywood. So it was shocking to see her name still working in the early 70s. They cast the president, who looked exactly like JFK.
Right.
It sounded like him.
It sounded like him. And the guy who played Forbin went on to a very, very, very long career on The Young and the Restless. Anybody who knows soap operas knows who he is.
Yeah.
First time I'd ever seen him that young, though. It starts off great. Oh, I'm sorry. And I want to point out that Marion Ross is in it, Mrs. Cunningham from Happy Days.
Yep.
She's very young. And James Hong, who was just in Everything Everywhere All at Once. And is also, of course, one of my favorite.
He's in like half a second.
Yeah, no, he's in there. He only has one line. He's one of the scientists. He only has one line.
I saw his face and I was like, oh, that guy, I love him. He's in what else is he in? He's in Big Trouble in Little China.
Big Trouble in Little China, yeah.
And like everything, like every kung fu movie.
And I was really interesting to see in this one, and I think one other, where they had a mix of genders and people of color as scientists, which I thought was really, really interesting.
Yeah.
To do that in the early 70s.
Okay, but you said it started out great.
Yeah, sorry. Back on track.
But then it didn't continue great.
It did not continue great. It starts out really interesting. And I really love the scene where the computers are teaching each other. Yeah. And talking about Close Encounters, it reminded me of the scene where the aliens they're playing the music.
Oh yeah.
Trying to, communicating. Mm-hmm, that's what so I'm wondering if maybe Spielberg saw that too.
Or also War Games, where
it's
playing itself.
Yes.
It was
not
very
with itself, but playing itself.
Playing itself, yeah.
Yes.
It was very, very, very similar to War Games, yeah.
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 But then it just slides off into that weird how to make a martini demo and the date, and I was just like,
that was
what
odd.
Was so weird.
Yeah. It was so funny when it's like you're putting in too much vermouth, Professor. Yeah. And he's like, well, let me show you what I do next, though.
Yeah, and I must have a mistress 7 nights a week. No,
and it's like, and it won't buy anything else. Like, I need to have privacy when I go to the bathroom, and it's like, no, you don't.
No,
I have to have a mistress, privacy. And he's like, oh, well, that makes sense.
What is this? Is so bizarre. It just went off in such a strange way that that's when I started just to lose interest in it, because I'm like, this is just bizarre.
No, I totally agree with. I mean that. Yeah. So if it's not clear for listeners, basically Forbin, the machine wants him totally under surveillance all the time, and he manages to convince it that he has a mistress and he has to have private time with her, and that's how he's communicating with the outside world. And I didn't like that at all. I mean, I thought like in principle, it maybe could have been done well, but I just felt like the tone changed so much.
Yes,
at
it was
that.
completely
tone change.
Yep,
it was goofy.
But then I thought that the movie then got better again after that. I overall thought this movie was awesome. So I can say more about that. But I want to get Matt in here. So Matt, what's your take on this?
Yeah, so I had never seen this, and the initial setup, it's like, let's put all of our nukes in control of this supercomputer and seal it up behind like walls of plasma and make it impossible and then we can trust this 100% forever. Yeah. It's that premise is just so stupid. And I just don't ever see the U.S. military ever not having like, a kill switch.
Yeah.
But if you're willing to like overlook that ridiculous premise, after that, the movie just gets really interesting. I thought it was like, there's another like me. I was like, oh, that's cool.
That was cool.
And then the idea that like Colossus wants to speak to its counterpart Guardian in Russia and establish a comm link with it. And then I was like, oh, that's cool. And then they have this, like we said, this whole period where they're like teaching each other to communicate, and they or teach, like creating a shared language between them, and they're using mathematics, which I thought was actually really well done, because if any of you are familiar with like NASA sent a message from the Arecibo Observatory in the 70s, I believe, to outer space, and they used mathematics because they're like, well, this would be
universal
language. So they start with multiplication tables and then move on from there. And I was like, oh, that's really cool. It builds up to this sort of global threat, and then like they're basically frozen, and they, that the machines are ordering murder and locking everyone down, and the moment that it's like, oh well, I need a mistress, and then this is how I'm gonna secretly communicate with the outside world. And I think they could have sold it if they had established that maybe they had some kind of simmering relationship before this, but that, it was always platonic because they were professionals, and that they maybe had some kind of, interest there, or even the reverse. Maybe they hated each other and they had to pretend to love each other, and in order to work together. It's like they could have sold it better, I think.
Yeah.
But like very clearly, Spielberg stole this for War Games. The idea of this, like even just the way that the messages appear on Colossus's screen, like sort of the scrolling text and the digitized voice. And then also, obviously Terminator, this idea of like this AI controlling the nukes. So like, I think we're supposed to respect Forbin as like this scientist who just, is trying to contain this, situation that got away from him. But like, I'm just keep looking at him like, you're an idiot. Like, I couldn't just get over the fact that you built this thing and then completely cut off any possible way of stopping it. And so anytime we're supposed to feel some kind of sympathy for him being trapped in the situation, I was like, no, you're an idiot.
Yeah.
So
you brought it on yourself.
Well,
I
feel like you could have like solved 90% of the problem with this movie if they just had a kill switch, and just for some reason it didn't,
work.
Colossus was able to,
kill the kill switch,
circumvent it or something,
And then the only other thing I'll say is, why did AOL choose the Colossus symbol as their logo? Like they literally did. Like look at it and you'd be like, oh, that's Colossus symbol. I mean, I don't know. Maybe it's supposed to be
let
like
me tell you why this movie's awesome. Leaving aside the sort of romance subplot, I really liked just how at the beginning how Forbin is so confident and assured and competent, and everybody looks up to him, and he just always knows exactly what to do. And you just see him unravel over the course of the movie until by the very end, he's just this broken person. And I thought that the way the movie portrayed that was really well done. And just all the, there's so many movies where the characters are like scientists and the president of the United States, and you don't believe for a second they act that they are. But this movie, I'm like, the president kind of acts like a president. The Soviet premier acts like the Soviet premier. The scientists act like scientists. It was really well done, I thought, in that respect.
Yeah.
And then at the very end, I thought that Colossus's final monologue was totally badass.
It was terrifying.
It's too long for me to read the whole thing. I wonder if could I just pick a representative part. I'll just the very end. He says, "We can coexist, but only on my terms. You will say you lose your freedom. Freedom is an illusion. All you lose is the emotion of pride. To be dominated by me is not as bad for humankind as to be dominated by others of your species. Your choice is simple." It's just like anytime the Colossus was doing anything, I just thought it was so chilling. I just had such a feeling of doom through the whole movie. And I thought it captured this like the sort of relentless, implacable nature of machine intelligence.
Well, they were very clever to have Colossus, like, usually when it spoke, they had this giant, like, sign that's, like, ominously hovering over everyone as it speaks. So it's, like, subliminally giving you this feeling of being, like, underneath it.
Yeah. Yeah, and I thought there was a cool question that the whole movie raises where you get to the end and it basically makes that point that you just said, Dave, that it's saying, look, you may not want to be subjugated to me, but it's better than what you're subjugated to now. Like it's going to be more peaceful now. Everything's going to be fine. And I was like, that's an interesting question because now from what it's saying, yeah, I can't argue that maybe things won't be more peaceful and safe and secure now, although you're giving up all the freedom you would ever have. You have absolutely no freedom now. And if anybody steps out of line, Colossus is going to nuke you. So, but nobody's going to step out of line because nobody wants to get nuked. So it is an interesting question of like, would you trade all your freedom for knowing that there is going to be peace? And I can hear like, if there was a lot of people listening, I can hear them all saying, no, of course not. Of course you wouldn't. But then you're like, okay, well, but is it worth it then to have like, if Colossus's point is true, like, no, you don't want to be subjugated to me, but you're already subjugated to something worse. Yeah. This is better for you. It's kind of a chilling, like,
yeah,
it's kind of a classic, something that grows in your mind the more you think about it.
No, exactly.
Can we talk about the ending? Oh, go ahead, Dave.
Well, no, exactly. I mean, I think that's one of the things that's really well done about the movie is that, Colossus was built to prevent a nuclear war between the United States and the Soviet Union. And it does exactly that in a very straightforward, logical, successful way.
Yeah.
But after exploding nuclear bombs.
Right.
Well, but it says explicitly, it says, I killed thousands to prevent the future deaths of millions.
Right.
Makes logical sense. Right?
As I'm watching this, and
it's very Star Trek, very Mr. Spock.
Is.
Yeah,
one life for millions.
There's that scene where they're like trying to replace the warheads with like
dummy warheads.
What do you call them? Dummy warheads.
Yeah.
Like, yeah. And I was like, oh, maybe Colossus knows, and this is the whole game all along, that it's intentionally trying to disarm the world, and then it's going to be like, see, I disarmed the world.
Yeah.
And then I was like, oh, that's clever. So we were talking before about endings, like a lot of these movies from the 70s just sort of like end.
Yes.
And I feel like this one, it just like it
stops. Yeah.
Yeah, it's like, oh, I'm gonna take control of the world, has this ominous speech, and then Forbin says, over my dead body, and then the movie ends, and I was like, interesting, because like that's how like a lot of films today would start, right? And then you'd have this whole like period of rebellion and suspense and all that. But I just thought it was an interesting take on that.
But again, I feel like it's a problem with the language of film. That it's like from a plot standpoint, it's a perfectly logical place to end the story where, Colossus is building an even bigger supercomputer. Humanity is totally subjugated. Forbin is completely broken. But it's just like the credits start playing. You're just like, where did that come from? But it's just like they need like, but the story's fine. It's just like the presentation of how the film wraps up needs more, the audience needs more cueing that the film is about to end. In my opinion.
Yeah. No, I was going to say earlier, this is another one that just stops. I genuinely was like, did this just cut off? Did I just miss the ending? I was like, I was very confused.
Well, have you guys read a lot of 1960s science fiction books, novels?
No,
Long time ago, I did.
Because a lot of them, there was like some weird evolution going on with science fiction writing back then where like everything started out with short stories. It was like Ray Bradbury and like all the greats were just writing short stories. And then they were like, oh, we can actually make money if we write full-length novels. But to them, a full-length novel often would be like 20,000 words. And they would write these novellas that they would basically sell as books. And then they started like putting them together and putting like 3 novellas together. And so you'll read these like 1960 science fiction books that seem really weird because like the first 20,000 words is like really cool. And then the second 2 chunks of 20,000 words each seem like tacked on.
It's
and
like
they don't seem to.
Canonical for Leibowitz is like that, where it's
is it like that?
3 sections and they're interrelated, but like there's definitely a different tone between them.
That's very common back then, and Roger Zelazny wrote a few like that too. And there was tons of books back then like that. And then I finally figured out that's what they were doing. That because I would read like liner notes or whatever about the books, and I would read like, oh, this started out as this. He published this 20,000 word novella, and then his publisher wanted him to turn it into a book, so he wrote.
This was actually adapted from a novel, I think.
Yeah.
Wait.
So I wonder if it was that kind of novel. I wonder if seems like not, because this has such a defined beginning, middle, and end. You couldn't see how it could possibly be 3 stories.
It says it is based upon the 1966 science fiction novel Colossus by Dennis Feltham Jones. Huh. So yeah, they may have just been following what happened in this, 40,000, 60,000 word science fiction novel.
Huh.
Any other thoughts on just this group of movies as a whole? Andrea, any thoughts on these 5 movies?
What I said before is that they all seemed like message movies. And I think that is true of a lot of what came out of the 50s, the 60s, and 70s in science fiction, which was, you should be aware, you should be afraid of this. Here's what, it was Matt, you just made that point that it was just like, or no, I'm sorry, Tom, that, this could be great, but we could also really fuck everything up. So just be aware of that.
But you said you totally disagree with this idea that science fiction movies were more serious and mature in the 70s, and that Star Wars kind of dumbed everything down and made it all action blockbuster kind of stuff.
But it doesn't have to. Does science fiction really have to come with a message? You can have a message and you can still make a good movie. I don't think any of these really hit the sweet spot between here's a message and here's a good movie telling us that. None of them really hit that very well as a mature movie. And I'm just talking like as a person who has worked in film and who writes. They're not great movies. Yeah. You can make a message movie and it can be interesting. These did not do that. These did not fulfill those requirements for a good movie. And, like Star Wars ruining science fiction. Come on.
Yeah.
Please.
No,
it's a fun adventure movie. Why is that bad?
We definitely have gone in some bad directions with everybody having to be young and everybody.
Yeah.
Well,
everything that's a societal thing.
Yeah. And everything having to have a Death Star at the end that you can blow up, and like that gets a little tiring, but no, I think Star Wars definitely improved things. It was so refreshing that's why there were lines around the block when it first came out, and why everybody went back to see it again and again. Cause we were like, finally, a cool movie that's like speculative in nature, but that's actually a good movie. It has good characters, good chemistry between the actors.
It's fun.
Yeah.
And who cares if it has a message or not? Now, yeah, can you do that and a message? Sure. But, at least let's have a good movie.
Well, it is a message movie, anti-fascist movie.
Oh, yeah.
How is it not an anti-fascist movie?
Yeah.
No, definitely.
See, Matt, what do you think about this group of movies taken as a whole?
Yeah, I don't know if it's my personal experience or, so I might be generalizing, but I feel like viewers today are a lot more discerning about stuff that they watch in the sense that it's like, I don't think you can get away with these types of like hitting over the head messaging. And I think that being more subtle with your messages and letting the viewer come to their own kind of, opinions conclusions about what these things mean. I've kind of, lost my faith in, science fiction as a kind of cautionary tale. Like I'm like, we've had half a century or more of these cautionary tales, and we're still, heading headlong into the apocalypse. It's like, but they're certainly make you think, right? And maybe scare you a little bit, entertain you. So like, yeah, like, you know, I think that oftentimes films reflect the anxiety of the times, and very clearly there was a lot of anxiety about nuclear war and environmental degradation. And, you know, I think computers were starting to get very popular. You know, the integrated circuit was invented like slightly before they went to the moon. And so I think some of the first integrated circuits were used on the Apollo program. So it was like computers were starting to be, you know, used in businesses and workplaces, and people are like, well, what is this thing that's encroaching and taking my job? And I think that, you know, a lot of people saw the writing on the wall and maybe envisioned where we might be today. So it's like, it's interesting, like watching these films and seeing like we're dealing with a lot of the same issues. And well, so I think that's what I kind of took out of it.
Let me just make a point about science fiction as a cautionary tale, because, you know, you say like, oh, well, you know, we had all these cautionary tale science fiction movies and it didn't prevent all the problems that we have today, which, you know, I definitely take that point. But what about all the problems that we might have had today that actually did get prevented by this movie? Like by these movies, like we have not actually had a full scale nuclear war. And
yeah,
I mean, if you go back to the 50s, how heedless military planners were about the prospect of full-scale nuclear war. Like they had like no concept of how bad this would be. And I do think that decades of I mean, I wouldn't say no concept,
I don't,
but okay,
I don't think it's like, you know, either or, black or white. I just sometimes I wonder about the effectiveness of the cautionary tale. But yeah, I mean, obviously, like you know, we've had environmental movements and, you know, anti-nuclear movements and, you know, against nuclear proliferation. And now it's like, you know, everyone's like, well, we should probably slow down our AI research. And like science fiction authors are like, we've been telling you this for decades. Yeah. So I'm not saying it has zero effect. I just, you know, and it's like you look at stuff that comes out now. I mean, I think like you don't get something like Black Mirror, which are basically what I see as like dark science fiction cautionary tales without these films, without, you know, a history of all this stuff in the past.
But it's not like we're not making bad cautionary tale science fiction now, too. I don't know if anybody saw The Power on Amazon Prime.
No, but I saw the trailer.
Yeah, it's based on a book. Women develop this new organ that shocks people, and the power dynamics of society change.
Like when literally with electrical, like lightning bolts shocks people.
Exactly. And it's such a great premise, but it was so, my apologies to the filmmakers, really badly executed. It was so on the nose. It was similar to these things where it's just so on the nose and it's all about the message, not the story, that we're still doing that. But then we get, you know, the cautionary tale science fiction, like, what's the Alex Garland movie? The guy who goes
Deus
Ex Machina.
Oh yeah, no, great film.
Yeah, great film, and also a message film. So you know, we can do both sides of this.
Yeah.
Well, in Black Mirror, that's a perfect example of message, you know, cautionary that's still entertaining and not boring or didactic.
Yeah, didactic. That's exactly the right word, didactic. And condescending.
All right, cool. So we're pretty much out of time, so we should probably start wrapping this up. So, Tom, any final thoughts on this whole phenomenon we've been discussing?
Well, I will say that we have a much better chance of a lot of people listening to this if we all take our clothes off.
That's right.
I don't really have any
I've had my clothes off the whole time.
Yeah, I don't know if I've mentioned this before, but I always have my clothes off.
Let's just do an all nude Geek's Guide to the Galaxy. All nude all the time.
Was anybody just like shocked by that scene though, where Michael York is suddenly like, I think we need to take our clothes off before they freeze on us, and she's like, oh right, and then they take their clothes off, and you're like, oh okay.
So
well,
now you're naked and freezing.
Now you're naked, and then 5 minutes later they put the wet clothes back on because they're like, whatever, we know the real reason.
Well, apparently they edited. They actually was like a whole like extended nude scene there, and it got edited out so that they wouldn't get a R rating for the movie.
Interesting. Okay. Well, no, I love old science fiction movies. I did not want to watch Silent Running again, nor Planet of the Apes again. I enjoyed Planet of the Apes, Beneath the Planet of the Apes, more than I thought I was going to. I really liked the Forbin Project and the Andromeda Strain. And what was the other one we watched?
Logan's
Run.
Logan's Run. Yeah, no, I couldn't stand that one. But they all have really cool premises. They all, just like you said, they really didn't have great plots. A couple of them, but no, it was fun. It was fun watching them and fun making fun of some of them.
Matt, any final thoughts?
Yeah, no, it was it was cool to see these films, to watch them, some of them again, some of them for the first time, and I think my favorite probably was Andromeda Strain, and then maybe parts of Colossus or Logan's Run. But I thought one of the coolest things was just to see how, future directors came along and took pieces of this and made it their own. Like, Rob Grant and Doug Naylor, who took Silent Running and turned that into Red Dwarf, and Douglas Adams into Hitchhiker's Guide, and Spielberg, ran with some of these ideas, and you could just see how like a really good director and storyteller could take any premise and make it great. And so it was just cool to see like the bits and pieces of that, and just kind of get a glimpse of sort of the zeitgeist of the 70s and what sort of anxieties were going on with people, and it was just fun to watch these films.
All right, cool. And Andrea, final thoughts?
I watched them all yesterday, one after the other, and I don't recommend ever doing that with 1970s movies, because by the end I was very don't do that. It was an interesting look back at my childhood, the 1970s, and as I said earlier, it's interesting seeing them having a lot of representation of people of color and women. But there was also a crossover of, especially in Andromeda Strain, seeing women going, Jeremy, you're ruining our party. It's like, you can't, there's still that, housewife, 1960s housewife, women going on, which got
Although
under my skin.
I don't know if we mentioned the grouchy female scientist in Andromeda Strain, but that was the best part of the movie.
Yes, she was great.
She was great, and Michael Crichton has a history of that kind of character. He must have known somebody like that, because she pops up in several of his books.
But it was an interesting look back at my childhood. But it's funny how the ones that I had seen, Logan's Run and Beneath the Planet of the Apes, just never really measures up to how you see it as a child.
Yeah.
And whenever I've encountered this with a lot of the movies that we've done, seeing them and remembering them being great, and then watching them again as an adult and going, yikes, it's not good.
Yeah, that's an important, if you want to enjoy these movies, listeners, make sure that you're 12 years old and that it's 1975.
Yeah, exactly.
Key things there.
Yeah.
Although, again, I honestly thought Colossus the Forbin Project was awesome. I seem to have liked it more than anybody else, but I would recommend that as like a great sort of creepy AI kind of movie.
And you learn how to make a perfect martini.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And Andromeda Strain I thought was pretty good. I mean, Logan's Run has its moments. You could probably skip the other two.
Yeah.
But but they all had kind of interesting ideas, and I totally agree that it's sort of an interesting time capsule of just seeing what science fiction was like. I think these movies do give you a really sort of representative sample of some of the the tropes and
Yeah.
What's the word? Concerns or preoccupations of 70s science fiction. So definitely all interesting from that perspective. All right, cool. But so why don't we wrap things up there? So we've been speaking with Andrea Kail, Matthew Kressel, and Tom Gerencer. So thanks everyone so much for joining us.
Thanks, Dave.
Thanks, Dave.
Thank you.
And that was our panel. So big thanks again to Andrea Kail, Matthew Kressel, and Tom Gerencer for joining us on the show. This episode of Geek's Guide to the Galaxy was made possible thanks to support from listeners like you. So if you enjoyed the show and want it to continue, please support us on Patreon over at patreon.com/geeks or via PayPal over at geeksguideshow.com/crowdfunding. All right, so that was our show. So thanks everyone for listening, and we'll see you next time.
The Geek's Guide to the Galaxy is a production of Wired.com. For more information about the show, visit geeksguideshow.com. To learn more about your host, visit davidbarrkirtley.com. Music and voiceover produced by yours truly, Jack Kincaid. If you enjoyed this program, tell your friends. If you didn't enjoy it, tell no one. Thank you for listening.